right. Hello, everyone. I am Sarah. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the DEI coordinator for the Columbia School of Social Work. So I know we have a couple of faculty, staff, students, and prospective students here. Welcome. We're gonna get started with the panelists. So I'm gonna let them introduce themselves, and we'll start with JP.
So I'm JP. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a queer artist in New York City. I do drag, and then I also do trans and other forms of gender equity consulting for nonprofits and other organizations that want to shift towards like social justice. I'm really grateful to share space with different people and also engage in conversations about how these things affect us. So I'm really happy to be here amongst these other queer diasporic folk to learn more about this thing we call Hispanic heritage together. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Isa.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be back again this year. I am Isa Noyola, she, her. I am from the Bay, California. My familia is from Mexico. And I'm the Deputy Director at Mi Gente, a national base building Latinx organization. We have different hubs in Georgia, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, Pennsylvania. And we are about building power with our people through electoral work and also organizing work with different campaigns like No Tech for ICE. So I'm happy to be here to share with y'all, and also I'm eager to hear the other panelists and their stories.
Yay. And that leaves me, I guess. My name is Bryan Clavel. I am a fine art and commercial photographer based out of New York City, Brooklyn. But I work bi-coastally, essentially just displaying the myriad of skins that queerness encompasses. So that's me. I use they, them pronouns.
All right, thank you, the three of you. And I know, Isa, you mentioned you might have to hop off, so feel free. Lovely to have the three of you here, but if you need to hop off because life happens, we're happy to have you for as long as you can stay. All right, so the first question is, and just, this is the quintessential question, I suppose, is what does Hispanic Heritage Month mean to the three of you?
I think to me, Hispanic Heritage Month just means celebration of identity and culture for obviously like the myriads of Hispanics and Latinx people, I think, at least in the United States right now.
Absolutely.
I think months like these allow us the opportunity to kind of want to look into our history and our heritage to kind of understand it more. And then hopefully it gives us an opportunity, like a beacon and a time for us to find each other to also have these conversations and learn about ourselves and share about ourselves. I'm of like mixed Dominican descent in the Latin American diaspora. So I think, as an opportunity for me to look and, understand that there's a wide variety of us and some of our stories go untold. So an opportunity to step forward and have those conversations and be present.
I don't know. As much as I realize that this event is happening because of this month, I also like to push back around the idea of this month. I don't know.
Yes.
Absolutely. No, I love that. And I'm glad that we started off the bat with that because yes, of course, like I'm serious though. Like yes, like I, was tasked with putting together a Hispanic Heritage Month panel and, the upcoming Heritage Month panels, but like we're always talking about these things. We're always queer people, or we're always people of color, or we're always like it doesn't stop at the month. So I think that's a really important point to start off, to not negate the point of this panel, but to also start off to say like life is intersectional and existence is intersectional, and just because it's like 1 month of whether it's Pride Month or Hispanic Heritage Month or Indigenous Heritage Month or whatever it might be, it doesn't stop, on the first of the next month. All right. So, what are some misconceptions people have about you, how you identify your heritage? So maybe, first of all, like that it's just that you're Hispanic or Latinx, and that doesn't intersect with anything else. But what are maybe some other misconceptions that people have, especially around the language of like Hispanic versus Latinx? Because I feel like we don't really talk about that. It's just kind of like an umbrella term that not everybody knows what it means.
I feel like those are two different questions for me specifically, but I think I can go into like what I was thinking about specifically about Hispanic Heritage Month. It's like Hispanic Heritage Month is an understanding that this area of land and its people were taken over by a group of people and their heritage was then mixed with all of these people. So by descent, I have Hispanic heritage because we were colonized by Spanish people. And then Latin identity is different because it also calls into like this identity of like indigeneity, blackness, and the diaspora, and then how we exist within that. Like there's colorism, whiteness, and black Latinx folks within that. So that's what I was thinking about when it comes to the term Hispanic Heritage Month and how I identify with it. And then misconceptions about my identity is just like stories of non-binary Hispanic people or Latinx people or diasporic people don't get told. So people don't have have like a conception of like how to treat me or how to engage with me or how to engage with people across the gender spectrum when we identify as Hispanic or Latinx in our own communities. And then even in queer spaces where if you're not coded as white, you have a harder time like kind of self-identifying within the community in a way.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I feel like similarly, the misconception that happens for, I think, in my own life is this idea that you have to present a certain way to be proud or to show off your heritage. There's a lot of people specifically branding identity around um, like accentuating their heritage. And it doesn't make those of us who aren't consistently like, i.e., performing Spanish songs all the time in drag scenes less Latin or less proud of who we are and what we've come from. So I think specifically people have these misconceptions about what it means to exist in the world as a proud Latinx individual.
Yeah.
I, you know, I find it amazing that like in this conversation we're bringing in artists and like the culture piece in this as something important because I always think about it. I think so many people just want to talk or relate to this month through a kind of I don't know, social or like political identity and as like a voter block or as like a people that can do something for this system, like as a we're we contribute, we're productive, we're citizens, we're this, we're that, like as something that can kind of continue to perpetuate sort of the same systems that harm us, that criminalize us, that torture us and punish us in detention centers, right? Like,
Yeah.
and we're having to be proud to be American citizens at the same time, right? And so it's I think some of the misconceptions that in the same time we can be proud, there's a lot of complicated ways that we navigate being on this land and the contradictions that exist within our people, the racism that exists within our people, the xenophobia, the transphobia, and so I think in all that, how can we still move at how can we still build healthy communities? How can we still have dialogue in the midst of all that? And I think so much of this, it is, there is a richness to our culture and our heritage, and there's like some kitchen table talks we should have as community, as familia. So much of my story with family has to deal with like some hard truths that we've had to talk through that has been painful, and we don't want to confront, and I think having conversations like this, always at least gives me some sense of hope that, okay, folks, we might not get it right. We might say some things that whatever, like land some kind of way, but like we're trying, we're trying and we're trying to, kind of thread the needle and follow what is like in front of us. So
Yeah.
I mean, jumping right off of what Nisa said, I think it's the conversations that are most like terrifying to have and most difficult to have are the ones that we should be having. You know, growth does not happen in comfort, and change cannot truly be ignited without fueling a fire that will interrupt what we've come to know as our reality.
Yeah, no, those are all fantastic points. I feel like the theme is like it's not just about like Hispanic heritage, and it's about the political side of things, it's about the cultural side of things, it's about the building relationships with family and loved ones side of things. They're not just like easy conversations.
Yeah, and I think that's something that gets watered down with like the simplicity of documentation. Like we get put into this little box that is like Hispanic or Latinx in documentation and in conversation, and we lose ourselves because there's such a richness of experiences that have just been kind of washed away by this like brown washing essentially of Hispanic identity, where it's like, no, like there's so much more, not just this experience of like being colonized by Spanish people, and now having to identify as like under this umbrella of people.
Yeah, that reminds me of every time I see like being asked to identify a race or ethnicity on forms. um, I always, and I'm not a Hispanic or Latinx person. I'm a person of color though. But I always think about that box that's like, are you Hispanic slash Latino or are you not? And I always wonder, do the three of you have any thoughts on like what goes through your head when you see that box? I mean, is it like an easy check off, or like that seems like JP was saying, such a generalization of an entire culture and experience.
I'm sure it causes a mini identity crisis in all of us when we have to look at a piece of documentation and like kind of then conceptualize our entire like cultural identity, our racial identity, and like all these other things within this little tiny spectrum. And then also like sometimes they'll make it so that you can't identify as Black and Latinx, which is weird also. And it'll change how people treat you in spaces. So like for me, it's just like recognizing that you're self-identifying in a system that's then placing value on how you identify. There's a safety in colorism and being in that Latinx spectrum that once you also mark the Black box does not give you that safety. So it makes me think about those things, and how we have to choose. I'm like, I'm so much more. It's so hard.
Oh yeah, I definitely used to panic as a child growing up, and it's always like, are you Hispanic or Latino? Check followed by, what is your race? And it was that combination that always fueled conversation in my own head, growing up, as to who am I? You know, if if I'm being reduced to my simplest form, then who am I at the base? Am I Hispanic first, or can I still encompass so many things? Um, it was just absolutely terrifying, and it still is. Uh, Even now, as I've grown older and developed a language to help me clarify identity a little bit more, I still run into a little bit of a crisis when I have to subject myself to being reduced.
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, my reaction is fuck all that. And it
Sure.
is, uh, it to me, it's like, especially like government forms and, having to check boxes, you know, I, yeah, I so much of my work is like to like put into question all of that. And I, even going through TSA and, having them look at your identity documents and look at you and question your, whether it's citizenship, your gender, like it's like a litany of things. Like this, person at the ticketing at, has to ask all these questions to verify who I am as a person, to in order to simply travel, right? And so, um, to me, that's where like our society has gotten to, you know, like to like since 9/11, we've accepted that we have a Department of Homeland Security, that we can have these systems that uphold and ask us these invasive and intrusive questions in the name of national security, right? And so I think those are the pieces that we have to constantly push back on as, again, it's like a hard conversation, like our in terms of identity politics, right? Like we value identities and there's nuance and there's beauty in the complexity of that. And then also how is that being used against us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like we feel that as queer trans people too. Like I want to say, like, audience, come back in a couple of weeks for the LGBT history panel because
Yeah, oh
they
my
want the same
God.
conversation around gender.
Yeah, and TSA. Oh,
Right, and TSA.
as someone who travels a lot for work, oh my
Ugh.
gosh, it is awful. And then they meet you with, what do you want to be scanned as?
Yeah. Anyway, what's like one big thing that like people don't understand that you just want people to understand?
You know that phrase that happens in that Selena movie where it's like you have to be more Latin than, and this is specifically coming from someone who's like Latin American. It's like we have to be more Latin than the Latin people and more American than the American people. I think people just like wash over that, and they don't really understand the complexities to that and how deeply that transcends. Like to perform whiteness for audiences that want it, and to perform Latin qualities. That's like it is such a torn experience. It is such a torn
Really?
experience to have to navigate through the world as both a brown person and an American that can perform whiteness, for safety. It's crazy how much we have to do that. And like identity in and of itself is a constantly changing thing. And so when you begin to develop language that can object to that, it I don't know, it gets really hard. And I just know that for a while, my own Latin qualities were repressed because of how I wanted to assimilate into the world and how I wanted to go unnoticed. And it's just, I think what people don't understand is the internal conflict that comes with existing and navigating through the world as both brown person who is celebrated in America only for specific qualities that can be fetishized.
This experience isn't a monolith. Like my experience as a Dominican person who grew up in Uptown Washington Heights in, degraded housing and low income experiences is going to be vastly different than someone who grew up in a residential community with a level of like social security, social security in the sense of like stores that had good food, access to different things, so that like this idea that we're a monolith of our cultural experience doesn't exist. And just that I think my overall critique of everything usually is like, I wish we understood more nuance.
Yeah.
I mean, it is in digging into the nuances that I think is important to understand the richness of our community, right? That, as we talk about culture, we're talking about class, we're talking about race, we're talking about all the different pieces like that really inform like our journey. And like, my familia came into this country, undocumented in the 70s. And at that time, the immigration policy was different. So their ways of understanding this country and their process is totally vastly different than folks, trying to cross the border right now who are met with very hostile policies and that are stuck at the border, right? Because of Trump and because of even Obama era politics. And so I think it is to understand, like all the different ways that we form into our identities, form into our, Latinx, identities, and how we relate to each other, and to understand the full breadth of that and what that means, right? And not limit it, that we're just one thing. Um, and so often I think people want to, as like, so much of what we hear is like, oh, we, especially in like popular culture and in Hollywood, like folks are pigeonholed into roles or like stereotypes or tropes, right? And yet we kind of also do that to each other,
Sure.
you know, as, especially as being a trans Latina, like there's just so many narratives about trans Latina women and what that looks like and what that means. Um, and just so very little is known, and so like so few people really engage with the community that are not from that community. And so um yeah, I think that we have to like intentionally dig in deeper and sink in a little more and listen a little more, like as folks of color, as folks who are struggling to like get free, and I think a perfect example of that, of what I'm reminded is, and right now I'm in Los Angeles, is you know is all of the city politics that are happening in Los Angeles, right? Between Latinx folks, brown Latinx folks, and Black communities. And it is it is taking a toll on not just this community, but like it has the national attention, right, around lifting up sort of what is it like anti-Blackness look like within our people, right, that are not Black and Latinx, and so I think that's an important, there's something that these moments like signal something, right? They signal something, and how do we pay attention? How do we have these conversations, even with our own families, of calling it out, when our aunties or mothers or grandmothers are saying something that they shouldn't, or they're like, or and we're trying to engage them, not just shut them down, but like, hey, what's behind that? Like, why are you saying X, Y, and Z thing that's racist, So I think this month should, if anything, prompt us to dig deeper within conversations within our circles that we have, within people that we are building relationships with.
Absolutely. I feel like I was just reading a news story this morning about I think it was Los Angeles or somewhere in California, the racism going on with the legislature, I think, and the political leaders in the community. It's wild. And I think that Amy was saying in the chat that like the word perform, and that like how powerful that is. That it sounds like the three of you are like the thing I'm noticing is like there is a certain level of like performance living as like a Hispanic or Latinx person in very white, very racist America, and like that intersection of like Bryan was saying, the performing as an American and then performing as like a Latinx person, and how those things intersect and how different performances are accepted or celebrated or not in different spaces.
Yeah, you know what? I often think about my experience growing up as a child, and only in reflection can I realize how divided growing up felt for me, because I couldn't language it back then. But even this idea of like being a child in America with like roots planted firmly in a different country
Mm.
was so difficult, um, because it always felt like I never had access to identity or to truly understand the richness of my own culture because of how separated it was. We used to do this project in elementary school, who it's like we have to build like an ancestral tree to truly understand our roots and to understand who we are as people and where we came from. And I don't think instructors that knew how complex it was for people who were first gen, um, because I didn't have access to that information. I
Yeah.
couldn't. We looked up. It was what was the website, ancestry.com. It's like you could type your name and like information about you and figure out who you were. I remember all of my classmates like had so much knowledge about who they were, and then there I was with nothing popping up,
Yeah.
nothing popping up for me, and how lonely and isolated that felt. Um, and then growing up, watching members or seeing or hearing about members of my family passing away in this other country felt like there was a library of information that was burning in front of me that I could never access to. Like, and not it wasn't even because of communication, but it was safety. You know, like I can't exist to my family in that country because of what is happening in those politics there and of information being used against them for who I was out here in the States. You know, I wish people knew specifically how much of my identity is born because of fear and how much of my identity today is having to unlearn all the safety like measures. Like I have to unlearn so many things to find who I am today because of how much of my identity was born out of fear.
Yeah, I think something that this makes me think about is like the level of access that there is in assimilation and how a certain amount of assimilation isn't adaptable to our cultural experience, you know? Like there's only so much that we can do to make ourselves legible to the system, make ourselves legible to the people around us within our cultural context without this history that we don't have because it's taken away from us because we have to adopt these identities that are closer and more palatable to white folks usually most often because that's how you get access, that's how you get resources, that's how, if I'm being honest, you end up on a conversation like this, and then having to do the work to unpack how those things are genuinely harmful so then you can come back and have these conversations, be like, we need to sit with and have a conversation about how these things are bad so then we can talk about the good. Like there's a lot of joy. I'm actually experiencing a lot of joy having this difficult conversation because it fills me with a level of hope, like Isa said earlier, that we don't necessarily have to mask, that we don't have to participate in that palatability to have this conversation, to be resourced for our, you know, needs and be present with each other. And that's what that was making me think about. Sometimes I speak in resonances instead of like answering complete questions, but thank you all. I'm really grateful to be here.
Oh, I love hearing that. And yeah, Amy's saying in the chat, thank you for your vulnerability. I mean, your fear so openly is really difficult. Truly, like, thank you all for for sharing. And I'm glad that like this conversation is giving you some glimmer of hope and you know maybe some feeling of community and belonging. And these questions are always just a stepping point. Like I just want the three of you to share whatever comes to your mind. So we've been talking a little bit about your like Hispanic or Latinx roots. How do you experience like staying connected to your roots or like not staying connected to your roots? Do you think that's important? Does it like always fill you with joy or is it kind of a mixed experience?
For me personally, it is so pivotal to connect to those aspects of my life because, like I said earlier, when I was a child, I thought I had to blend in as much as possible and forget who I was as an individual and culture. The reality is that I will never navigate through the world as a white individual. I will always be met as a brown person first or as a gender nonconforming person first. It's like that experience always comes undeniably. So to me, in order to understand beyond what I've come to know about myself, I have to know who my family was. Who were they outside of this country? You know, I I have to connect to my native tongue, to my language, to people who can understand what it means to be Latin, you know, and not even in the sense of like what it means to be Latin in America, but what it means to be Latin also in Mexico too. I need to know these things so that then I can begin to shape an identity that feels round and and beautiful. I do I don't want to abandon myself ever. And it feels like when I when I walk through the world and pretend like this part of me is not real, but I am walking away from a greater, more beautiful side that I can learn to appreciate.
I mean, I think for me, you know, there's a complicatedness because I think there is sort of like connecting with my roots and uh, ancestry. There is trauma and there is like fucked upness within my family and, you know, these hard truths that we've talked about it, but they're still hard. And they still feel a lot. And I've had to set boundaries at times with family and with, and like, how can I still connect to where like my roots and my family are, and you know, and that's been a complicated journey. And I think for me, you know, engaging in other communities and other queer trans communities in Mexico, or through cultural practice or spiritual practice of seeking out healers and curanderas and ceremonia, like that's been, I think, a big part of reclaiming and decolonizing parts that were told to me that were not who I was, but they really are. They're actually truer than what, you know, like the Christian parts of my upbringing were, you know,
Sure.
the
Yeah.
middle class Christian parts of who I was raised to believe that that's the aspiration, that's the goal, you know. So that's been hard. That's been a hard journey.
I think what I'm hearing is also that it's like hard to grapple with this idea of connection when we feel so disconnected from like our immediate communities and how they treat us as individuals, which is really true. One of the ways that I work to like unpack and reconcile this is understand that like there's a rich and also kind of violent history that we come from. So also recognizing and paying respect to the people that fought for freedoms in various locations across the Latin American diaspora, from Haiti all the way to Mexico, you know, and things that happen along those lines, and learning those deep histories so that we could see how people fought for these freedoms that we're still fighting for today. And then connecting with other queer trans people who are from Hispanic descent, who are from Black descent, who have a level of cultural or spiritual alignment with us, so that we can do this collective healing work in places that make us feel good, that people that understand our cultural context, or at least understand some version of it, and then I can also learn from theirs, you know, similar to this conversation, and connecting with those roots, and then also recognizing that there have been, you know, queer, trans, indigenous, Black, diasporic ancestors that have existed that were reverent in their communities, that, you know, we might not even know about, but we can look up and learn their histories. Immediately as I have this conversation, I'm like Sylvia Rivera here in New York City, you know, of Puerto Rican descent, in the Latin American diaspora. So yeah, it makes me think about this idea of connection as queer trans people who are often not part of this connective tissue in our community.
Actually, that was one of my other questions, is like, um, who are some role models that you can think of? And JP, do you want to say, for people who don't know who Sylvia Rivera is, do you want to maybe share a little bit of history as to what
Yes,
she's done?
Sylvia Rivera was a co-conspirator of Marsha P. Johnson, who was one of the most reverent figures of the Stonewall uprisings over 50 years ago, the mother of Black trans liberation, now known as Gay Liberation Movement. And Sylvia Rivera was their partner in crime and a confidant and supporter and sister, you know, as we are to each other, family. And they started, after that, they also started a small group and house in the Bronx called Star. It was Street Transvestite something something, I can't remember right now. And they helped and support other people who were sex workers, nightlife performers, who weren't embraced by their families, seek autonomy and fight for their liberation. And that's who I would talk about if I was going to answer this question, which I did by happenstance.
Yeah, no, thank you. And yeah, if you have any other role models that, or like important people that are kind of like breaking barriers in the field, whether that's historically or presently.
I just would uplift, and for folks who haven't checked out Compton's Cafeteria, right? It's in San Francisco. Felicia Flames, she was a screaming queen, badass trans Latina who passed um, a couple years ago, and um, yeah, was a part of sort of that string of uprisings against the police. You know, where a whole bunch of trans women were, you know, harassed for engaging in community. You know, essentially, and so I would check that out. It should be on PBS. Compton's Cafeteria Riots, Felicia Flames.
Thank you.
Mine would probably be it's not really a known figure. I would choose my mother. like
Yeah, absolutely.
like role models. My mother, but also what she represents, and that is every person who has dared to cross the country, every immigrant person who has ever entered the United States and been told consistently that you cannot belong here, or that you cannot plant roots here. When American history is founded on literally immigrating and looking for more, you know, granted, there's also a history of colonialism entwined into there, but roots are all about believing that we can belong wherever we want and that you can have homes everywhere. My mother left an entire career. My mother is one of my biggest role models because she walked away from, she was a doctor. She has a master's in math. She taught chemistry and physics in Mexico and biology. She walked away from all of that to come to the United States to wash dishes and be a porter, all because of what was happening there. People all, whenever I say that, people often meet me with, why did she leave all of that to come be a porter here in the United States? And that is because, you know, my family was being murdered in Mexico, dragged out of their houses and being murdered on the streets. They were murdered on the streets. And my mother walked away from all that because she had a glimmer of hope that her children would not have to worry about being killed like that, not in such a brutal way, you know, and that's why she was like, she came to a country where she did not speak English and has learned through passing. I one time worked immediately following high school. I started a job as a porter and janitor for the convention centers in Las Vegas, um, which my mother had already been working at for 5 years. There were 12-hour shifts, sometimes went over into 15-hour shifts, depending on how long it would take to get the job done. But there were 15-hour shifts. And when I tell you, I have never been met with as much like bigotry as that position fled me with, it's just like wild. Like on my first day, there was people coming up to me, slowing their speech down to try to talk to me because they assumed that one, I couldn't speak English, and two, that I was to some degree not as bright as them or was not as intelligent, cannot hold conversation. It was, I was in awe at how much labor there was to that work, how much like brutal force. Like I commend anyone who did that, who has done that for years, who came over here in the 70s and started working in plantains. Like or not, I think it wasn't plantain. What is the word for like crop maintenance and stuff like that? Uh, it's just like wild. There's so much labor twined to immigrants, and I don't know. Those are the people that I look up to, the people who do it all the way.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. JP, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would also say local activists and icons, Lorena Borjas, who recently passed away, but whose work is still affecting legislature today, like repealing things like walking while trans, and other things. And then Cecilia Gentili, who is a local trans activist who's been doing great work about providing people who engage in survival sex trade or in survival trades of any kind with getting access to like healthcare services through Callan Lord. Those people really inspire me to like continue to do this work and show up. And then also like provide resources to the community, you know?
Yeah, thank you, JP and Bryan, for both sharing. Some role models, some people that they don't always have to be larger than life role models, right? Like sometimes it's family, sometimes it's a mother who gave up. My mom's an immigrant. Like I can relate to some of the things you were saying, Bryan. I really want, this is like, I'm personally curious, and also I think this is a great question. Since Bryan and JP, you're both very openly queer trans people, in addition to being Hispanic and Latinx, how does your identity intersect? We've talked a little bit about this, but how does it intersect with your queerness? What maybe like some day-to-day things, like you both do drag. If you want to talk about that, and because I've seen you both do drag, and I think you're both fantastic. And how does how is it being Latinx and trans non-binary in your day-to-day life?
It is an immersive experience filled with lots of unlearning. Like
Sure.
every single day, I have to unlearn something about who I thought I had to be. And a lot of it, so I talk a lot about celebrating my identity and my culture, but also at the same time recognizing that I have to critique it at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I have to critique it and look at it with kinder eyes and with grace. You know, I was born and assigned male at birth, and so a lot of the things that I walk and navigate through the world today, I have to remind myself that I don't have to perform that so vigorously. I don't have to do that. I'm no longer in a position where my safety is in question, and I have to be this person. You know, I can figure out who I am more and more. And we were briefly chatting earlier about what it means to exist as a trans person and then perform drag
Mm-hmm.
at the same time. And what I find often is that in the beginning, as I was coming to terms with who I was in the gender and in my own gender, I realized that I was using drag to cope with that and to give me euphoria for my own femininity. And because of that, I wasn't allowing myself to explore drag as performance art and more so using it as a way to feel euphoric in my own body. And so the minute that I liberated myself from this idea of having to be just that and I could be femme all the time was the day that I got to see drag as an extension of performance, as an extension of my art and creativity, and not just about looking at it as a mechanism to feed my own joy, like for gender.
Yeah.
I'm like, I think it's interesting that you talk about leaning away from that experience because when I speak to so many, like specifically trans drag kings, it's like the opportunity and the ability to merge this idea of like gender euphoria with this like pure expression of a lot of the things that we practice as children, we listen to the music videos, we move around as drag artists specifically. And sometimes once we have the opportunity and avenue and the safety that doing drag provides for us to perform our gender, because also it provides a level of safety. You're being paid, you're being supported by the establishment you're in, there's certain where in our immediate communities we might not have access to that. So thinking about how that shows up differently in people's experiences. So thank you for sharing. But yeah, I think I participate more in that splitting of my identity where I don't see how my queerness is um, embraced by Latinx identities or Hispanic folks, and having to figure out how to contextualize my experience within that, you know, because I still exist, I'm still being, I'm still here. And then there are other people that have that experience. So with that specifically, I've sought community in like places like Puerto Rico, other places in the South American and Latin American diaspora, so that I can learn about the queer people who are in other places also experiencing this like level of disconnection. Like we're in it and we're amongst our mutual community, but we don't feel connected to most of it, because it doesn't reflect sometimes the really hard things we have to look about, because sometimes we have to have this rose-colored, joy-colored lens to have some of these conversations. So it's a constant act of like the self-identification that Bryan was touching on, and like this shedding of these identities that you have to put on so that you can be accepted, but also recognizing that sometimes we do still live inside that system, and there's things that we have to do for our safety and how we navigate the world, especially with heightened agitation towards trans people specifically, in our local communities and from people who are legislating against us, you know?
Yeah. But do you ever feel pressured to like perform Latin numbers or like stick to a Latin or Hispanic vibe in your drag?
Personally, no. I've used opportunities where I was booked for Hispanic Latinx things, or when I went to Puerto Rico to perform, to do that music because it feels more authentic and more of the culture and the experience that I'm providing, as opposed to performing it for people, when I haven't necessarily reconciled how I feel about that within myself. So those have also been healing experiences for me to connect with my culture. You know, I'm using our shared language and understanding to break these barriers and better understand each other through performance, through music, where out here I'm trying to understand myself and how I fit into the social context, and not necessarily bring I bring all of myself to every performance, but I'm also like holding parts of myself that I feel like I'm still figuring out. But that's how that's shown up for me, and like displaying my heritage through performance.
I do feel pressure. I do
Sure.
100%. Especially when I'm booked for specific like Latin venues, like or like Latin shows. I think I have two different monthlies that are celebrating Hispanic culture, and I often find myself applying pressure into like what I'm going to perform. Like, oh my God, I'm like, I have to be so Latina that show. I have to exude Latinx like pride, but how do I do that? And I'm like, you have to do a Latin number. What I've come to realize through friends in the scene like Frida Kahlo is that Latin to be Latin is to exist in a myriad of skins. You know, to be Latin is to love both aspects of who you are, and to be proud and Latin American is to recognize how you can exist with English songs just as much and resonate with English songs as Spanish songs. So when I find myself wanting to perform Latin music, or even wanting to make Spanish, like music in Spanish, I have to tell myself, you know, I'm doing this so that I can connect with that language more. And so I can connect with the audience in a way that I want to use that native tongue. Because to me, I feel so amazing when I can talk in Spanish with people because it just feels organic. It feels like community. It feels like coming home. And so when I want to use Spanish in music, I want to feel like coming home too.
Thank you for sharing. And I can appreciate that you two have like different experiences, different perspectives on like feeling pressures, or it's also the kind of drag king versus drag queen experience. I mean, since we're talking about it, do you two want to plug your any social media since we're talking about your drag?
Absolutely. You can follow me on Instagram at Privilege Queen. That's PRIVILEGE Queen, QUEEN. Queen.
All right, and JP put theirs in the chat.
It's harder to type it out too.
Sure. Yeah, I love running into the both of you in the drag scene in New York City. And absolutely, if I'm booking the audience, if you are in New York City, whether that's Queens, Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, I don't know about Staten Island, but please check these two out. They're amazing drag artists, and they're just fun. It's fun to go to their shows and see them perform, and see that intersection of like queerness and culture, like POC culture, whether that be Hispanic, Latin, or whatever else. All right, I'm gonna throw one more question at you, both of you. I always like to end with this kind of question, and it's a big, like, conceptual question. But what would you say beneficial, active allyship looks like to you in terms of Hispanic Latinx heritage?
I'm like, I guess beneficial allyship is like the palatable version of like co-conspiratorship. I want people who are going to co-conspire with Black Latinx folks and who are doing anti-racist work, you know? And I feel like that's just across the spectrum of identity. Like, I want people who are interrogating these notions of assimilation and palatability. And then also willing to be humble when we have certain privileges, you know, whether that's our presentation, whether that's the way that we are able to articulate certain things, even though we might be burning with rage, these things, and making them instrumental for how we can contextualize it across the spectrum. Because it's like about educating and meeting people where they're at. So using your privileges to get us into these spaces to have these conversations, you know, as often as possible, not just brown folks or Hispanic people, but Black folks, Black people across the Latin American diaspora and queer diaspora, you know. Um, yeah, people who are putting their privilege aside and having these like humble and like really intercommunal conversations that need to be had. And that's what beneficial allyship looks like to me. I'm like, this conversation is an opportunity for folks to engage in that practice, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that mention of like using your privilege to bring those of us that are marginalized into spaces that, or into opportunities that we don't normally have access to.
I agree. And I also believe like beneficial allyship looks like someone who's willing to do the work outside of just meeting the people. You know, like do your own research to inform yourself on like what it means to walk through the world and help the people who you want to help. You know, interrupt the cyclical patterns of oppression by interrupting conversations that specifically target us or that oppress us. You know, do don't just perform it for us. I don't want somebody who stands in charity with me. I want somebody who stands in solidarity.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's, thank you both for sharing. Um, and I'm especially thinking of what I know is happening in New York City nightlife, and you know the diversity and equity issues that have been raised over the last 6 months. Um, yeah, it's just, thank you both for sharing. I think that like co-conspiratorship, or that like solidarity is so important, and people forget that sometimes it's the little things. Like sometimes we can't do a lot, but it's like the little things and the little supports that can make a difference. From Amy, and she was asking, I think this was related to whatever we were talking about at the time, but JP and Bryan, what are your strategies for healing? Do you have any that you're willing to share?
One of my greatest strategies for healing is like honestly resourcing myself with information and tools to do so, and like also community who help me stay intentional about those things, which is also kind of hard. I'm neurodiverse, so I struggle with like certain executive functioning things and like discernment and all of these other things. So also when like these feelings of fear and scarcity come up within me that are tied to like things like Latinidad and like the precarity of our rights, you know, learning more about our histories, learning more about how things affect me and how things that I do also affect other people helps resource me for that healing so I can better show up for other people and myself. And that's what I do. And that's what comes. Oh, also like meditating if I can, if my brain does the thing, so that I can regulate and move my body. So drag also helps, movement practices and things like that.
I think one of the best practices for healing for me was learning to give people grace for not knowing something or for being wrong about things. One of the biggest things that I've come to say now is um, you you cool people down at the speed in which they were warmed. You know, or no, you warm someone up at the speed in which they were cooled. You warm someone up at the speed in which they were cooled. It's a lot like hypothermia, you know. It takes a long time to learn, uh, to unlearn prejudices, to unlearn hate. And so, for instance, with my relationship with my own father, he spent years not having to ever interact with a queer person. He spent a life before mine not knowing what queer meant or who was queer or how to navigate through their world or their own hardships. He didn't have to. That's not the life he had to navigate through. It wasn't then, but it is now. He has to know me. He has to interact with me. And because of that, like things happened so fast. It took me 25 years to begin to understand my own identity. Can't expect him to change overnight. And so it's just about gentle reminders and giving him space to learn and educate himself at the same time as also reminding myself to not abandon who I am. You know, I can only begin to heal when I've realized that like the people around me are on a separate journey as well to comprehension.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, um, we talk a lot about healing in terms of like, not to negate what you said, JP, but like in terms of like meditating or, you know, treating yourself to something or whatever. But I really like the idea of healing as um, also just like being, I mean, not like letting things go necessarily, but like being patient and um, being patient with the people around you and recognizing that like everybody's on their own journey and just kind of letting things flow around you. And sometimes that's holding on to that frustration can be hard, and just letting it go. And again, not to excuse things or completely let things go, and in terms of like people being inconsiderate or wherever it might be, but to recognize that like Bryan was saying, everybody's on their own journey, and sometimes you just gotta let the things flow around you. And I feel like we don't talk about that in terms of healing enough. So thank you for mentioning that. My other questions that I was thinking of throughout the conversations we've had today. What do you think about representation in Hispanic Latinx representation in media, whether that be news or fictional TV shows? What are your kind of initial thoughts that come to mind? Is it, I mean, I'm sure it's a mixed bag, but
I think it immediately makes me think of like colorism specifically because we don't have a diverse representation of our experience, like culturally specifically, but then also like sometimes the people that are in the telenovelas are like really fair-skinned white ladies with blonde hair in the starring role who has a lot of screen time, you
Mhm.
know, and I see myself having consumed those experiences, or even like let's say specifically Gordo y la Flaca, which is another like culturally relevant show. It was a white woman who was on television most often. So there's a lot of those ongoing narratives of like there's not space for people who look outside of a certain frame of a beauty standard, and those things still apply. But I do think that like looking towards queer trans people and how they express themselves and like the accessibility of people on the internet helps to, you know, wash away these preconceived narratives and also gives people space to have those conversations. You know, like we've always had a Celia Cruz, you know, and now we have an Amara La Negra, you know, who's a Black Afro Caribbean woman who talks about this stuff and colorism and how that shows up in their work. So yeah, I think the accessibility of the internet has definitely helped with the representation of us being able to find each other. But the media itself is like still really slow to catch up and like recognize that like it's not all In the Heights and Lin-Manuel Miranda movies, you know?
Yeah.
I agree with all that. I think that the number one thing facing like media representation for Latin people is like, again, is colorism and our refusal to acknowledge Blackness within our own culture. You know, we were colonized, so there is a lot of white passing Latinx folk who are benefiting from their own privilege and are not using their platforms enough to elevate more of the black and brown people in our own communities. You know, a lot of times when you look at even telenovelas, the people who were cast as, you know, saviors were fucking white, and the people who were villains were brown and black. And so I I just want to see more representation of like the joy in loving our own color or loving color too. You know, there's this phrase in Spanish called tenemos que mejorar la raza, which I heard growing up a lot, which loosely translates to we need to better the race. And always using the context of how do you better the race? But you better the race by marrying white and lightening your skin color.
um, I also want to hear your thoughts around, or y'all both talked about like the concept of white passing, or what are your thoughts around whether it's being around like skin color or even gender too? What are your thoughts around passing privilege? I'm always curious about this.
Yeah, no, I mean, passing is like the same thing as like, you know, light skin versus, you know, dark skin discourse. It's like this understanding of colorism that flattens our identities and is harmful, but it's like an ongoing symptom of like this project of mestizaje and like browning everything so that we have a harder time kind of contextualizing what our cultural struggles are, that we're working class, that we're black, that we're white, that we're rich context of people. And then also like it's also this understanding that like we I think Americans also make it all about us. Like it's the conversation of passing doesn't also acknowledge cultural understanding and how we show up across the cultural diaspora. So like being light skinned in Brazil and being light skinned in Dominican Republic and all these things come with similar privileges, but depending on the cultural context, the way that we're treated is different. So I think yeah, it's really reductive most of the conversations that I hear, but it's good to have nuanced conversations about how that shows up in our life. Like, what is the privilege that you have by being more palatable? Like, I talked about mine on this panel, you know? What are you doing to talk about that and bring that to light?
Absolutely. And Amy's saying in the chat in Indian culture, which I mentioned my mom's an immigrant. She's from India. If you're talking about Indian in terms of India culture, there's a cream called Fair and Lovely, which is a skin lightening cream, which is uh, what a thought, what a concept. um, Brian, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's so important to um, when having conversations to also acknowledge the positionalities that we encompass. We are filled with like so many, you know, and a lot of them do. They have different levels of both uh, experiencing oppression and benefiting from privilege. And so when talking about like passing privileges or white passing qualities, like we need those voices to understand identity so that they can have the conversations with the people who are oppressing us because they can be accepted a lot faster into those communities and interrupt those patterns easier than it is uh, to be at the forefront of a movement when you are already declared the villain.
And I think the ongoing theme is that like white folks across the spectrum of identity need to step up and have these conversations. And that includes Latin American white folks and American white folks and diasporic white folks, you know?
I have one more question, and then we'll, wrap up and call it a day. We mentioned briefly, I think we were talking about at some point, faith and religion. Do either of you have thoughts around just kind of, that's a whole other conversation, but some kind of maybe surface level thoughts about your relationship with how your Hispanic or Latinx identity intersects with any kind of, if you have any kind of spirituality or faith or religion?
I think for a while I was torn with this idea of searching for faith in a community that exiled me for so long. And what I realized is that I don't need them to tell me that what I believe is valid. I don't need that. I don't need to go looking for validity in this community. All I have to know is what I believe to be true, and that is that my faith will love me, like my God will love me, for who I am. And my God is not prejudiced. My God is not hateful. And um, I was brought up Catholic, and so I learned a lot of the spiritualities, but I've also learned to tell myself, some of it could be wrong, you know, some of it could be wrong. It's just being lost in translation. And I can learn to practice that. And at the forefront of spirituality, I think what it wants us to practice is just kindness. Like be kind simply because you can be, not because you have to be.
Yeah, I look at specifically like religion or different ideologies. It's like a framework from which to relate to the world too. Like if you're using this framework to enrich your life and be affirming towards other, like, and that's what gets you there, like these stories are what brings that to you, then definitely go ahead and practice that. But it seems often more than not that the way that people practice these things, it becomes intrinsic to their beliefs and their how they think other people should operate, and then that becomes more of like a chastising tool and a tool of control that we should understand that like any tools that are used to control someone because they're being used to control us isn't going to help us get out of the situation, you know? So in my own spirituality, it's more about like letting go of those rigid things and healing from those experiences where people were telling me. And I'm like, I think of the Bible as a collection of stories from different cultures, and then they were written by a white person over and over and over again, and adapted from different people's ideologies. So it's like there's a hint of truth in all of these things, depending on where they were documented. But if you dig a little deeper, it's probably a story about someone else's deity, or their other cultural experiences, if you dig a little deeper. And then specifically for me, I'm like, I look to my spirits, my direct ancestors, people who I knew in my life who have passed, or people who came before me in my own lineage, because that's where that heritage and that healing and that spiritual work and enlightenment is better suited to, healing those things that they experience, and then therefore hopefully healing myself.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for sharing that. Thank you, everyone, for participating, for attending, and take care.